Clara Whitmore slammed both palms flat on the counter and looked Silas Granger dead in the eye. "You will not touch me," she said. Not ever. My father's debt dies with him." Silas smiled. It was the worst kind of smile, slow, patient, the kind worn by a man who has never once been told no and lived to regret it. "Honey," he said softly, "your daddy didn't just leave you that broken-down store. He left you to me. If you've ever felt like the whole world turned its back on you, the moment you needed it most, stay with me. This story is for you. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you know someone who needs to hear a tale about dignity, survival, and a love that nobody coming, share this with them tonight. Now let's go back to Black Hollow, Colorado, 1878, and to a young woman who refused to be broken. The funeral had been 3 days ago. 3 days since Clara Whitmore stood at the edge of a frozen hill outside Black Hollow and watched 4 men lower her father into ground that was too cold and too hard for the work it was being asked to do. 3 days since she'd pressed her lips together, so tightly they'd gone white, because she had promised herself she would not cry in front of strangers. 3 days since Pastor Henley had said words over Owen Whitmore's grave that were kind and well-intentioned and rang completely hollow, because Owen Whitmore had not been a saint, and his daughter was the only person standing there, honest enough to know it. He'd been a man who loved too hard and planned too little. A man who believed the mountain would eventually give him what he was looking for, if only he dug deep enough and stayed long enough and refused to quit when every reasonable sign told him to. He'd spent 11 years digging holes in the earth outside Black Hollow, convinced that gold was just one more foot of rock away. He'd borrowed money to buy equipment. He'd borrowed more money to pay the first loan. He'd borrowed a third time to survive the winter when the second shaft collapsed and took 6 weeks of work with it. And then his heart had given out on a Tuesday morning in February, and Clara had found him face down in the mud beside the eastern shaft with his pickaxe still in his hand, and the mountain had kept every single secret it had ever held. She had not cried then either. She had gone back to the store, opened the accounts ledger, and spent 4 hours adding numbers that refused to become anything except catastrophic. The general store her father had built on the edge of Black Hollow's Main Street had been the one thing he'd owned outright, or so Clara had believed. It turned out Owen Whitmore had used it as collateral on the largest of his loans, a loan extended by a man named Silas Granger, who owned the mill, the lumber yard, 2 of the town's saloons, and the patience of a man who understood that the best time to collect a debt was not the day it came due, but the day the debtor was no longer around to argue. Clara had known Silas Granger by reputation her entire life. Every woman in Black Hollow did. He was the kind of man who smiled with his teeth and watched with his eyes and kept very careful track of what people owed him, not because he needed the money, but because he understood that debt was power, and power was the only thing that had ever mattered to him. She had not expected him to come so soon. She had expected a letter. Perhaps a formal notice from a lawyer in Denver. Something with official language and a reasonable timeline, the way civilized business was supposed to work. Instead, Silas Granger had come in person, on the 3rd day after her father's funeral, with 2 men flanking him like parentheses around a threat. Clara had been behind the counter when they walked in. She'd been taking inventory, counting cans of beans and bolts of fabric and sacks of flour, trying what could be sold and what could be used to negotiate. Because she had already accepted that negotiation was coming, and she intended to be ready for it. She was wearing her father's old leather apron, because she'd put it on that morning without thinking about it, and hadn't taken it off, because the smell of its sawdust and tobacco and something that was just him was the only comfort she'd allowed herself since Tuesday. She looked up when the bell above the door rang. She recognized Silas immediately. He was a compact man, smaller than people imagined from his reputation, narrow through the shoulders, with the kind of physical economy that belonged to men who had spent their lives making other people do the heavy work. His suit was black and well cut and spotlessly clean in a town where clean clothing was a statement. His hat was new. His boots were shined. He carried a leather satchel under one arm, and he smiled at Clara the moment he saw her, and every instinct she possessed told her that smile was a door closing, not opening. "Miss Whitmore," he said pleasantly, "my condolences on your loss." "Mr. Granger." She kept her voice level. She set down her pencil. She did not come out from behind the counter. "I've been expecting to hear from you." "Then we can skip the formalities." He set the satchel on the counter between them and opened the clasp with the deliberate ease of a man who had done this before. He pulled out a ledger not her father's, a different one, heavier, bound in dark green leather, and laid it flat. "Your father's outstanding balance, as of the date of his death, stands at $4,216. Interest included." Clara looked at the number. She had already known it was going to be bad. She had not known it was going to be that bad. She kept her face still. "The store," she said. "It was listed as collateral." "It was." Silas nodded pleasantly, "which means it belongs to me now, technically." However, he paused, and that pause was doing work she didn't like. "I'm not an unreasonable man, Miss Whitmore. I'm not here to put a grieving young woman out on the street." "I appreciate that," Clara said carefully, because something in the air had shifted, and she could feel both of his men moving slightly, not threatening yet, just repositioning, and she was already calculating the distance to the door behind her. "I have a proposal," Silas continued. He folded his hands on top of the ledger. "There is an establishment I own, through associates, over in Crestfield. A hotel of sorts. They are always in need of reliable young women who know how to manage accounts, keep guests comfortable, ensure everything runs smoothly." He let that sentence breathe for a moment, let every layer of it settle. "The arrangement would allow you to work off your father's debt over time. Comfortably, in a warm place, well-fed, well-housed." The room was very quiet. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the two men behind him. She looked back at Silas, at his folded hands and his patient smile and his spotless black suit. "No," she said, just the one word, flat and final as a door slamming. Silas tilted his head slightly. "Miss Whitmore, my father's debt is my father's debt," Clara said. "It does not transfer to me. Not legally, not morally, not in any way that any court in Colorado would recognize. You know that. And you know exactly what establishment you're describing in Crestfield. And I'd like you to take that proposal and your ledger and your two friends and walk back out the door you came in." The smile on Silas's face didn't disappear. It just changed quality the way a fire changes quality when you stop feeding it and it starts looking for something else to burn. "The store is collateral," he said, and his voice had gone quieter and somehow more dangerous for it. "Which means I can call this loan today right now, and you have nothing. You are standing in my store, Miss Whitmore, and I can have you removed from it before sundown." "Then have me removed," Clara said. "I'll sleep on the street before I go anywhere near Crestfield." One of the men behind Silas took a step forward. Clara grabbed the wooden handle of the nearest thing she could reach, a cast-iron skillet hanging from a hook at the end of the counter, and brought it around in front of her. "Don't," she said. The man stopped. Silas made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "You can't hold that thing all night, sweetheart." "I don't need to hold it all night," Clara said. "I just need to hold it long enough." Long enough for what? She had no good answer to that. She was alone. She had been alone since Tuesday. She had one cast-iron skillet, and a room full of debts and men who were between her and everything, and the honest answer to Silas's question was that she didn't know what she was waiting for. She only knew she was not going anywhere. The man who had stepped forward moved again. And then the front door of the store exploded inward. Not opened, exploded. Both panels swinging hard on their hinges and cracking back against the wall on either side, sending the little bell that hung above them flying off its nail and skittering across the floorboard. And in the frame, where the door had been, stood a man who seemed for a half-second to fill it completely. He was enormous, not just tall, but built on a different scale than the men already in the room, broad through the chest and shoulders in the way that comes not from vanity but from years of actual work. The kind of work that involves hauling and chopping and carrying and surviving at altitude, where the air is thin and the winters are trying to kill you on a daily basis. He wore a heavy canvas coat dark with old weather stains, leather boots wrapped at the ankle with fur, and a wide-brimmed hat that he did not remove. His beard was full and dark and going gray at the edges, and his face beneath it was the face of a man who had been alone long enough that the usual social instinct to look approachable had simply stopped firing. He looked at the room, he looked at Silas, he looked at the two men. He looked at Clara behind the counter, with her cast-iron skillet. His eyes stayed on her for exactly 1 second, then he walked in. Silas turned to face him, and for the first time Clara saw the slightest flicker of something, behind his eyes, not fear, not exactly, but the recognition of a variable he had not accounted for. "This is a private business matter," Silas said. "I'll thank you to wait outside." The man didn't answer. He walked to the counter, around the two men as if they were pieces of furniture, and set down on the wooden surface in front of Clara a leather pouch the size of a man's fist. It landed with a sound that was heavy and specific, the particular density of metal. He looked at Clara. "He says you owe him $4,000. His voice was low and rough in the way of a man who doesn't use it often enough to keep it smooth. Clara stared at him. Yes, my father's debt. How did you... Walls in this town are thin." He hadn't looked away from her. "You owe it? My father owed it." He nodded once as if that confirmed something. Then he opened the leather pouch and turned it over on the counter. Gold dust poured out in a slow cascade, catching what light came through the store's front windows, settling into a pile that was genuinely stunning. Not coins, not paper, not a promissory note, but raw gold the color of late afternoon. The kind that comes out of mountain streams and takes years of cold work to accumulate. Silas Granger went very still. One of his men actually took a step backward. The stranger looked at Silas. "Weigh it," he said. "I know what I'm looking at," Silas said, and his voice had changed completely. The pleasant theater of it was gone, and what was left was something more careful and calculating. "Then you know it covers the debt." The big man's voice was flat. "Certain. The way a man speaks when he has already made a decision, and is simply informing the room of its consequences. With enough left over to cover whatever interest you tacked on that doesn't appear in the original contract. Weigh it or don't. Either way, her debt is finished." Silas's jaw tightened. "And who exactly are you to be involving yourself in Miss Whitmore's financial affairs?" "A man with gold," he said it simply, "and you're a man who came here for money. So here's your money. We done?" The silence stretched. Clara watched Silas's face move through several calculations. She couldn't fully read the weighing of reputation against profit, of pride against the undeniable fact that there was enough gold dust on that counter to pay the debt twice, and there was a man behind it who gave every indication of being willing to cause significant physical difficulty if the answer came back wrong. Silas reached out and pushed the pile of gold dust back into the pouch with one deliberate sweep of his hand. "We're done," he said. He tucked the pouch under his arm where his satchel had been. He picked up his ledger. He nodded at his two men. And he walked out of the store with the precise, unhurried gait of a man who understands that retreating and losing are not the same thing, and that patience is a longer weapon than anything else in his arsenal. The bell was gone from above the door, so his exit was silent. Clara stood behind the counter for a long moment after he left. Her hands were still on the cast-iron skillet. She realized she was gripping it hard enough to hurt, and she set it down carefully on the counter and pressed both palms flat against the wood and looked at the stranger who had, in the space of about 4 minutes, paid $4,000 for a woman he had never met. He was looking back at her. He had not moved from where he stood. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't place, not expectation, not pride, not anything she would have predicted from a man who had just done what he'd done. He looked, more than anything, like a man who was waiting to see what she would do next and had no particular investment in the answer. "Who?" Clara said. "Wyatt Blackridge. I've never seen you before." "I don't come down to town much." She looked at him for a moment. "You said the walls were thin. You heard all of that from outside?" Enough of it. You carry $4,000 in gold dust on your person as a matter of habit." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "No, then why did you have it today?" He was quiet for a moment. "Was heading to the assayer's office. Had a good season." Clara let out a breath that was almost a laugh and had absolutely nothing funny in it. "Mr. Blackridge, that was everything you earned. You just handed a man like Silas Granger a season's worth of mining because you overheard a conversation through a wall." "Yes, ma'am. You don't know me." "No, then why?" She said it plainly, without performance, because she genuinely needed to understand. "Why would you do that? What do you want from me? What are you expecting in return for?" "Nothing." The word stopped her. He said it without emphasis, without the weight of a man making a grand gesture, just a flat, quiet statement of fact. Nothing. Like it was the most straightforward answer in the world, and he was slightly surprised she needed to ask. Clara stared at him. "That's not how the world works," she said. "Maybe not." He reached up and picked his hat off his head, turned it once in his hands and set it back. It was the first time she'd seen him make a gesture that looked even slightly uncertain. "I know what Crestfield is. I know what he was offering you. And I know what your father's debt had to do with any of that, which is nothing." He paused. "I had the means to stop it, so I stopped it." Clara was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the counter where the gold dust had been, at the bare wood that still held the impression of that weight, and she looked at this enormous, weather-scared stranger in her doorway who had apparently given away a year's worth of work because he believed people shouldn't be owned and had the particular brand of stubbornness required to act on that belief at significant personal cost. "You're not getting the store," she said finally. "I don't care how you frame it. I am not trading one creditor for another." He blinked. "I don't want the store. You don't want anything. I want some coffee if you've got it." He glanced toward the back of the store. "And maybe some of those dried beans if you're selling. I've got a long ride back up." Clara looked at him for another moment. Then she turned, picked up the coffee tin from the shelf behind her, and set it on the counter. "Sit down, Mr. Blackridge," she said. "You look like a man who's been standing outside in the cold for long enough." He sat. He had to angle himself on the stool to fit, and he folded his large hands on the counter in front of him with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to waiting out things much longer and colder than a conversation. Clara moved around behind the counter and started the coffee, and let the quiet settle between them because she had learned early that silence was useful. It told you things about a person that words wouldn't. Wyatt Blackridge sat in silence like it was furniture. Like he'd lived in it so long it had stopped being uncomfortable and become simply the atmosphere of his existence. "Where do you mine?" Clara asked after a while. "High up." "Above the tree line on the north ridge. Alone?" "Yes." "For how long?" He considered. 7 years. Clara poured the coffee when it was ready and set a cup in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around it and looked at it the way a man looks at something he's forgotten how good it feels. "You've been on that mountain for 7 years, she said, "alone. And you come down today, of all days with a full season's gold." "I come down a few times a year," he said, "for supplies." "But you had the gold today, and you heard me." "Yes." Clara sat down on the stool across the counter from him and wrapped her own hands around her own cup and looked at Wyatt Blackridge, this massive, quiet, extraordinarily strange man who had walked into her disaster like he'd expected to find it there. "My father owed Silas Granger that money because he believed the mountain would make him rich," she said. "It didn't." "No," Wyatt agreed. "He died believing it would." "He died with that pickaxe in his hand." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "I knew Owen Whitmore, not well. Saw him a few times up on the North Ridge years ago. He was on the wrong side of the mountain." Clara blinked. "I'm sorry? The gold's on the north face. He was working the east." "I tried to tell him once." He looked at his coffee. He didn't want to hear it from a stranger. Something about that sentence hit Clara in a place she hadn't expected. She thought about her father's stubbornness, his absolute conviction that he knew where the answer was, his inability to take direction from anyone. and how that pride had been one of his best qualities and one of his most destructive ones, and how she had loved him for both. No, she said quietly. He wouldn't have. They were quiet together for a moment. What are you going to do now? Wyatt asked. Clara looked around the store. At the shelves her father had built, at the counter she'd stood behind since she was old enough to reach it, at the window with the cracked corner pane that had needed replacing for 3 years, at the ledger sitting closed on the end of the counter, full of numbers that no longer added up to anything. I don't know, she said honestly. Silas took the debt money. But he'll be back. Men like him are always back. She paused. He owns the note on this building. I can't pay that either. I've got enough inventory to keep the store running for about 2 months if I'm careful, and then I've got nothing. Wyatt looked at his coffee cup. He turned it once in his hands. Come up to the mountain, he said. Clara looked at him. Not like that, he said immediately, and the roughness in his voice had shifted into something that sounded almost embarrassed. I've got a cabin. It's large enough. You'd have your own room. I could use someone too. I've got a lot of goods that need cataloging. Years worth. I've never been good with numbers. He stopped. He looked at her steadily. You'd be working. I'd pay you. Per arrangement, nothing more than that. You just gave away everything you earned this season, Clara said. I've got more, Mr. Blackridge. Wyatt. She stopped. Wyatt. She set her coffee down. She looked at her hands on the counter. You don't know me well enough to make an offer like that. And I don't know you well enough to accept one. That's fair, he said. She looked up. It's fair, he repeated. I'm not asking you to decide right now. He finished his coffee in 2 long swallows and set the cup down and stood up from the stool in a single movement that was quiet for a man. He reached into the coat pocket and set several coins on the counter payment for the coffee and the beans I'd asked about, a precise amount, not a cent more. You know where the North Ridge is? Everyone in Black Hollow knows where the North Ridge is. There's a trail marker about 4 miles up, carved elk on a pine. My cabin is 2 miles east from there. He picked up his hat and settled it back on his head. If you decide you want a different option than whatever Granger offers you next time he comes back, that's where I'll be. He looked at her for one more moment. Not with expectation, not with anything she could call calculation. Just looking. Like he wanted to remember her face for serious reason he hadn't entirely worked out yet. I'm sorry about your father, Miss Whitmore. And then he walked out of the store, and the door swung shut behind him without the bell that was no longer there to ring. And Clara sat alone in the quiet of a building that didn't quite belong to her anymore, and looked at the coins he'd left on the counter the exact right amount. Not a penny's leverage in either direction, and felt something she couldn't name beginning to shift in the place where her certainty used to live. She sat there for a long time. Outside, the February light was already going gold and thin, the way it did in Colorado when the sun started dropping behind the peaks and the temperature dropped with it fast. She could hear the town going about its afternoon voices from the saloon down the street, a horse being led somewhere, the distant clang of the smithy. Normal sounds. The sounds of a place that had watched her father burrow himself into the ground and would watch her struggle now without losing a minute of sleep over it. She looked at the cracked window pane. She thought about Silas Granger's smile and what it had meant and what it would mean when he came back. Because Wyatt Blackridge was right about one thing without question. Men like Silas were always back. The gold dust had closed one door. It had not changed the fundamental reality, which was that she was a woman alone in a building held by a man who had just been thwarted and would be looking, quietly and patiently, for the next leverage point. She thought about an elk carved into a pine tree 4 miles up a mountain. She thought about Wyatt Blackridge's hands around a coffee cup, and the way he'd sat in silence like it was home. She thought about 7 years alone above the tree line, and what a person would have to be, or have become, to choose that. She stood up. She went to the shelf behind the counter, and she found the thick wool blanket her father had kept there for cold nights, and she pulled it around her shoulders. She cast the tack down, and she opened the account's ledger to a fresh page, and began writing. Slowly and carefully, a list of everything she owned and everything she owed, and every option that lay between those two facts. It took her most of the night. By the time the lamp oil was running low and the page was full of her careful handwriting, Clara Whitmore had arrived at a number of conclusions, the most significant of which was this: a cage with familiar bars was still a cage. And a mountain she didn't know, with a man she barely understood, who had paid $4,000 for the principal of it and asked for nothing and left the exact change for his coffee, that was something she didn't have a word for yet. But it was not a cage. She blew out the lamp, she folded the list and put it in the pocket of her father's apron. And she sat in the dark of her father's store and thought about elk carved into pine trees and the sound a leather pouch full of gold makes when it lands on a counter between a man who expects to win and a man who has already decided otherwise. She left before dawn, not because she was afraid of what daylight would bring, though she was, but because leaving in the dark felt like a decision she was making entirely for herself, without the town watching, without anyone standing on a porch to see which direction Clara Whitmore went after everything fell apart. She packed what she could carry: the ledger, 2 changes of clothes, her mother's small silver brooch that had survived everything else, and enough dried provisions from the store shelves to last a week. She left the key on the counter, not for Silas, not as surrender. She left it because she was done pretending that building was something she could hold on to, and she had never in her life wanted to carry dead weight. The trail was exactly where Wyatt had said it would be. She found the carved elk on the pine just as the sky was beginning to lighten at its edges, a crude carving deep into the bark, clearly done by someone who had functional skill with a blade and no interest in art. The elk was recognizable. That was enough. She turned east from there and walked 2 miles into country that got progressively steeper and colder and quieter in the way that mountains are quiet, which is not like any other kind of quiet. It is a silence with weight to it, a silence that has been there longer than any human concern and will be there long after all human concerns are finished. She was not sure what she expected to find. What she found was a cabin that looked like it had been built by a man who intended to survive in it, and had never given a single thought to how it looked from the outside. It was solid, low, fitted against the hillside, in a way that suggested Wyatt had understood from the beginning that the mountain was the authority, and the structure's job was not to argue with it. There was a stack of wood so large it almost qualified as a building in its own right. There was a small shed. There was a line strung between 2 pines with nothing hanging on it. There was smoke coming from the chimney. She knocked. There was a long pause, then the sound of boots on a wood floor. Then the door opened, and Wyatt Blackridge stood looking down at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not surprise, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that suggested he had told himself not to expect her and had not entirely succeeded. He looked at her pack, he looked at her face. "You came," he said. "You said there was work," Clara said. "I need work. And I don't have anywhere else that isn't going to eventually end up with Silas Granger having an opinion about it." Wyatt stepped back from the door. "Coffee's on," he said. She walked in. The inside of the cabin was against all expectation, not chaos. It was cramped and dense with the accumulated materials of a man's solitary life: pelts, tools, crates, ropes, several items Clara couldn't immediately identify, but it had a system. Things were where they were because that was their place. The problem was that the system was entirely legible only to one person, and that person had been its sole user for 7 years, which meant it had evolved into something highly functional and completely impenetrable to anyone else. She stood in the middle of it and looked around slowly. "You said you needed someone for cataloging," she said. "Yes. How long has this been accumulating?" Wyatt looked around as if genuinely reassessing it from someone else's perspective, possibly for the first time. 7 years. "Right," Clara set her pack down. "Then we have a great deal to talk about." He poured the coffee. He showed her the room that would be hers, small, with a cot and a window that faced the ridge, clean in the basic functional sense, the kind of clean that means nothing is growing in it and nothing will fall on you. She set her bag on the cot. She came back out. She sat down at the table across from him, wrapped her hands around the coffee, and said, Tell me what you have and what think it's worth, and I'll tell you where your numbers are wrong." He looked at her for a moment. Something that might have been the very early beginning of respect settled in his eyes. And they started talking. What Clara had not anticipated, what she would not have guessed from their single 40-minute conversation in the store, was that Wyatt Blackridge, silent and solitary and terrifying in appearance, was in possession of an exceptionally precise mind. He knew exactly what he had. He knew its quality and its weight and his estimate of its market value. What he lacked was any system for recording it, cross-referencing it, or presenting it in any form that would be legible to anyone conducting a transaction with him, which was part of why his dealings with assay offices and supply merchants had always been inefficient and slightly combative. Because he would arrive knowing exactly what he had, and they would have no paperwork trail to support that knowledge, and the gap between those two positions was where men like Silas Granger made their money. Clara understood this immediately. She had been running her father's books since she was 16 years old. By midday, she had established a preliminary inventory system, and Wyatt had watched her build it without comment until she asked him a direct question, at which point he answered with precise, concise information and then went back to watching. It was disconcerting, and then it stopped being disconcerting and became simply his manner. The way some people listen with their whole attention and say very little, because they are processing rather than performing. "You don't have to watch me like you're expecting me to steal something," Clara said, not looking up from the ledger page. "I'm not." A pause. "I've just never seen anyone work that fast." She looked up. "I've been doing this since I was 16. "For your father's store?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Were his numbers always this bad?" Clara laughed. It surprised her she hadn't laughed in at least 2 weeks, and the sound of it in the tight space of the cabin was strange to her. "No," she said. "They got worse every year. He was a better miner than a businessman. Or he would have been if the mining had worked out." "He was on the wrong side of the mountain," Wyatt said again. "I know." She looked down at the page. "You said you tried to tell him." "Once." He looked at me like I was suggesting he'd misread scripture. He turned his coffee cup on the table. "I didn't push it. Wasn't my place. It might have been anyone's place," Clara said quietly. "He didn't listen to anyone, not even my mother when she was alive. He had his idea of how things were, and the world was supposed to accommodate it." She paused. "I loved him for that too, the certainty. When everything else was uncertain, he was always completely sure of himself. It was a comfort when I was young." She pressed her lips together. "Less of one when I was older and could see what it cost." Wyatt said nothing. He just listened in that complete unhurried way he had, and Clara had the strange and unfamiliar experience of feeling entirely heard without being required to say anything more. She went back to the ledger. By evening, she had a working draft of the first real accounting Wyatt Blackridge's holdings had ever had, and the number at the bottom of the page was significantly higher than what he'd been receiving from the assay office for years. She showed him. She watched his face process the difference. "They've been underpaying you," she said. "Not enormously, but consistently, about 8% below the going rate. Every transaction," she pointed to the column, "here. And here. And this one from last spring, do you remember what they told you this lot was worth?" He told her. She wrote the number down and put it next to what it should have been. Wyatt stared at the page for a long moment. 8%, he said. "Consistently, which means over 7 years. "I know what it means, over 7 years. His voice had gone very quiet and very flat, in a way Clara was beginning to understand, meant the opposite of nothing, meant something was happening behind it that he wasn't choosing to put into words. "You're not the only one they've done this to," she said. "Small miners, men who don't keep their own books. They calculate on the assumption that you won't check, and if you never have a record, you can't." "No," Wyatt said, "you do now." He looked at her across the table. Something in his expression had shifted the careful neutral surface of it, had developed a hairline crack, something underneath showing through, and what it looked like was not gratitude exactly. It looked like the recognition of an equal. like a man who had been operating in one room of his own capacity for a long time and had just realized there was an adjacent room he hadn't been using. "You're staying through winter," he said. It wasn't a question quite. It was somewhere between a question and a fact he was working out. "If you'll have me." Clara closed the ledger. "And if Silas Granger doesn't find a way to make it complicated." "He won't come up here." "You sound certain." "Men like Granger don't operate in places where they're outnumbered by the terrain," Wyatt said. "He needs witnesses and legal instruments, and a town full of people who owe him something. Up here he's just a man and he knows it." Clara considered this. It was, she thought, probably true. Silas Granger was a creature of social infrastructure. His power was borrowed from systems, from courts and sheriffs, and the web of obligation he'd spent decades constructing. Strip that away and what you had was a small man in a good suit. "That's actually very astute," she said. "I've had a long time to think about what kinds of men are dangerous, where," Wyatt said. "What made you come to Black Hollow?" Clara asked. She had not planned to ask it. It came out because she genuinely wanted to know. 7 years ago. "What brought you up here in the first place?" The question landed differently than she'd expected. She watched his hands still on the table, watched the quality of the silence change around him. "I had reasons to leave where I was," he said finally. "That's not an answer." "No." He looked at her steadily. "It's all I've got tonight." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, accepting it, because she understood the principle of information that has not yet earned its moment. She had things she wasn't ready to say either. "Good night, Wyatt," she said. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." "Clara," she said, "if I'm keeping your books, you can use my name." He turned his coffee cup one more time. "Good night, Clara." She went to her room. She lay on the cot and listened to the mountain wind in the pines. Something moving far off, the absolute difference between this quiet and the quiet of the store where she'd sat up through the night with a lamp burning low. This was not the quiet of a problem she couldn't solve. This was the quiet of a place that had been here long before the problem existed and would be here long after. It was not comfortable, but it was honest. She slept better than she had in weeks. The days that followed developed their own rhythm, the way days do when people are determined, not to make too much of living in close quarters carefully, with established boundaries and practical purpose, providing the structure that social convention usually supplied. Clara worked the accounts in the mornings. She cooked in the afternoons, which had not been part of the original arrangement, but which happened naturally on the third day when she realized Wyatt had been living exclusively on beans and dried meat and coffee, and occasional unfortunate piece of jerked venison. And whatever she thought about the situation she was in, she was not going to stand by and watch a man eat like that when she knew how to do better. She made a proper stew. She put it on the table. Wyatt sat down, looked at it, and didn't say a word for a long moment. "Eat it before it's cold," Clara said. He ate it. He ate a great deal of it. And he said, without looking up from the bowl, "I'd forgotten food could taste like this." "How long has it been since you had a real meal?" He thought about it. "A while. That's concerning, I manage." "You were managing to slowly disappear," Clara said. "That's different from managing." He looked up at that. Something flickered across his face, not offense exactly. More like a man who has had a truth spoken to him so plainly that he doesn't have a prepared response for it. He went back to the stew, but she noticed, from that evening onward, that he started sitting down to eat instead of standing at the counter, with a cold piece of something in his hand. And she noticed that the table had been cleared of the tools and papers that had covered it before she arrived. And she did not say anything about either thing, because she understood that some changes are large enough that pointing to them makes them collapse. It was on the 9th day that she found the box. She had been cataloging the storage area at the back of the cabin, a dense, low space packed with Wyatt's years of accumulated pelts and equipment, when her hand found something under a canvas tarp that wasn't tools or trade goods. It was a wooden box, roughly made, with a simple latch. She would not have opened it, would have simply moved it and cataloged it as personal effects, except that the latch was broken, and the lid shifted when she lifted the box to move it, and she saw for just a moment what was inside before she looked away. A child's boot, small, worn at the toe, and what might have been a woman's handkerchief, folded, with an embroidered edge. She latched the box, as well as the broken latch would allow, and put it back exactly where she had found it. She put the canvas tarp back in place. She went back to the main room and wrote down what she had cataloged, and left an empty line for the items under the tarp, and marked it Personal Do Not Inventory. When Wyatt came in that evening with the day's work done and snow starting to fall on the ridge, she didn't say anything about the box. But something had shifted in what she understood, and it changed the way she looked at him across the dinner table in a way she couldn't entirely account for. She had known he was a man who had come up the mountain to get away from something. She had not let herself think too hard about what that something might have been, because it hadn't been her business. She had learned young that other people's grief was a room you didn't walk into uninvited. But a child's boot, worn at the toe. She looked at his hands around his coffee cup, large and scarred and very still, and she thought about 7 years. And she thought about what a person carries up a mountain and what it does to them over time. And she felt something in her chest that was not romance and not pity, but something older and more serious than either the particular ache of recognizing damage that matches the shape of your own. It snowed heavily that night. By morning, the trail down to Black Hollow was buried under 2 feet and growing. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at it, and Wyatt came to stand behind her, not close, just behind, and looked out over the same white erasure of everything that had been a road. "We'll be here a while," he said. "How hard to say. Week, maybe 2 if it keeps up." He paused. "You're not going to panic about that." It was not a question. He said it like a man who has assessed a person carefully and arrived at a conclusion. "No," Clara said, "I'm not. Good." He pulled the door closed against the cold. "Then we have work to do." They had work to do, and they did it, side by side in the tight space of the cabin, and the snow kept coming, and the days accumulated. And something happened between them in that time that neither of them named, because naming it would have required one of them to speak first, and neither of them was built for that. What it was this. The careful formal distance of a professional arrangement began, slowly and inevitably, to be replaced by something that operated on different rules. It started small, the way he moved when she was working, no longer standing in the middle of the room, but shifted to the side, leaving her a clear path to the shelves she used. The way she started leaving the better chair angled toward the fire, because she'd noticed he favored his left side on cold days, some old injury never mentioned, and the heat helped. Small adjustments. The language of people who are paying attention to each other without admitting it. Then one evening he talked, not much, not a flood of revelation. But he was sitting across from her while she worked by lamplight, and she asked him a question about a series of transactions from 3 years ago that didn't add up, and in explaining them he mentioned, briefly and without emphasis, that he'd been dealing with the assay office less that year because he'd been sick, a bad winter, and she asked without thinking, "Was anyone with you?" And the silence that followed was its own kind of answer. "No," he said. "There used to be," he said. He was looking at the lamp, "My wife, and our daughter. We came out here together first, had a place in the valley. Smaller than this." He stopped. Clara didn't say anything. "Fever came through," he said finally, "the spring of my 2nd year here. I was up on the ridge when it hit. By the time I got back down," he stopped again. "Both of them." Clara set her pencil down. "I'm sorry," she said. She said it simply, because it was the truest thing, and the only thing that was worth saying. 7 years is a long time," he said. It didn't sound like he believed it. "Yes," she said, "and it isn't." He looked at her. "I lost my mother when I was 12, Clara said. "And some days it's been 20 years, and some days it's been 12, and some days it's been this morning. Grief doesn't run on a calendar." Something in his face did something she had not seen it do before. Not break, he was too controlled for breaking in the ordinary sense. But something released, like a tension held so long, it had stopped feeling like tension and had just become the shape of him. "No," he said quietly, "it doesn't." They sat with that for a while. The fire burned, the snow pressed against the window. And they were two people alone on a mountain in February with dead in common and work to do, and somewhere beneath both of those things, the very tentative beginning of something that had no name yet, but was gathering anyway. The way snow gathers quietly and then all at once. It was the next morning that Silas Granger's men came. Not Silas himself. Wyatt had been right about that. But two riders, hard men who knew horses and cold and not much else, arrived at the edge of the clearing at first light, and called out from a distance, which told Clara something about what Wyatt's reputation was in the valley below. They didn't come to the door. They shouted from where they were. Wyatt stepped outside. Clara stood just inside the doorway where she could hear. One of the men called out that Mr. Granger had a message for the woman staying on the mountain, and that he'd consider it a courtesy if she'd come back down to Black Hollow to discuss the matter of the store's outstanding mortgage, which remained unpaid regardless of what certain arrangements had been made regarding other debts. Wyatt let them finish. Then he said, in the specific flat tone Clara had come to understand meant he had already made a decision and was simply providing information. Miss Whitmore is employed by me as a bookkeeper. She's under contract. She'll come down when the contract term is finished. One of the men said that wasn't exactly how Mr. Granger understood the situation. I don't particularly care how Mr. Granger understands it, Wyatt said. The assay office in Denver has received a full accounting of Miss Whitmore's work on my behalf. The contract is registered. You're welcome to check it. He paused. You're also welcome to tell Mr. Granger that the same accounting includes 7 years of transaction records showing consistent undervaluation of my holdings by his associates at the Black Hollow assay office. I thought he might want to know that those records now exist in a place that isn't this mountain. There was a significant pause from the direction of the men on horses. Mr. Granger will want to speak with you directly, one of them said. Mr. Granger is welcome to send a letter, Wyatt said. When the snow clears. And then he came back inside and shut the door and walked past Clara without a word, sat down at the table, and poured himself coffee with the steady hands of a man who has just done something he thought through carefully and executed without performance. Clara stared at him. There is no contract registered with the Denver assay office, she said. There is now. He set the pot down. I rode down and filed it 2 days ago when the snow let up for an afternoon. Before that last storm, she kept staring. You anticipated this. I anticipated Silas would try something. He always does. He needs leverage, and he lost some when you left. So he'll look for a different kind. He looked at her. You know his patterns better than you think you do. You grew up watching your father try to work around them. The assay records, she said. You weren't bluffing. I don't bluff. He turned his cup in his hands. The records you compiled, I had copies made before you finished the original. They're in Denver. Clara sat down. She sat down because her legs had made that decision, before her mind caught up with it, because what she was looking at across this scratched pine table was a man who had not simply reacted to the situation she'd brought onto his mountain. He had thought 3 moves ahead of it. He had taken the work she did, the 8% discrepancy she'd found, the 7 years of records she'd painstakingly reconstructed, and turned it into a defensive position before she'd even understood it could be one. You used my work, she said slowly, not accusation. Something closer to wonder. Our work, he said. I couldn't have done it without the numbers. You could have told me. I didn't want to worry you before I knew it would hold, he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment, this man. This enormous, quiet, scarred man who had sat alone on a mountain for 7 years carrying a child's boot in a broken box, who had given away a season's gold for a stranger's dignity and not asked for anything, who had spent 2 days in the cold registering a legal document so that she would be protected before she knew she needed protecting. Why, she said, not about the assay records, not about the contract. About all of it. The same question she'd asked him in the store, which he hadn't fully answered. He looked at her. His eyes were dark and very steady. Because you're good at what you do, he said. And you shouldn't have to keep paying for your father's mistakes. That's not all of it, Clara said quietly. He was quiet for a moment. A long one. Outside, the wind had picked up again, and the fire moved with it, and the light in the cabin changed and settled. "No," Wyatt said, "it's not all of it." And that was as far as it went, because he stood up then and said there was wood to bring in before the next weather hit, and he put on his coat and went outside. And Clara sat at the table and pressed her hands flat against the wood and looked at them until they stopped shaking. She told herself it was the cold. She told herself that for the rest of the afternoon. By evening, she had mostly stopped telling herself anything and had simply accepted that something on this mountain between two people who had both been through enough to know better and were apparently going to do it. Anyway, slow and careful and with their eyes open, the way you walk out onto ice, when you're not sure for how thick it is because you have to get to the other side, and because standing still on the bank is not the same thing as being safe. She made dinner. He came in with the wood and stacked it and stood by for a minute to warm his hands. And she put 2 bowls on the table and sat down, and he sat across from her. And they ate in the particular silence that had stopped being the silence of strangers weeks ago and had become something else entirely, the silence of people who are learning each other's weight. Learning what the presence of another person feels like when it is not a threat or an obligation, when it is simply warmth, the cold place and company in a quiet one. "Wyatt," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "For the contract, for the records." She stopped. "For treating what I do like it matters." He held her gaze. "It does matter. A lot of men wouldn't see it that way." "A lot of men are fools," he said plainly. He went back to his dinner. And then after a moment quietly, without looking up, "What you did today." Staying calm when those men came, not flinching, he paused. "That matters too." Clara was quiet. She looked at her bowl. "I've had practice," she said, "at not flinching." "I know," he said, and that was the whole of it. But something in the way he said it, "I know," 2 words, with the weight of a man who has been paying attention and respecting what he sees, settled over Clara like the particular warmth of a fire on a very cold night. Not all-consuming, just necessary, just real. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, 2 damaged people sat across from each other in the lamplight and did not say what they were thinking. But they were both thinking it, and on a mountain in February, in a year when both of them had lost more than they'd expected to survive losing, that was enough. That was, in fact, everything. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried up the mountain by a boy from town who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, and handed the envelope to Clara through a crack in the door like he was afraid of what lived inside the cabin. Clara recognized the handwriting before she even broke the seal. She'd seen Silas Granger's precise, controlled script in enough contracts and receipts over the years to know it the way you know the sound of a voice you've learned not to trust. She carried the letter to the table and sat down and opened it slowly, because she'd also learned that bad news didn't change its content depending on how fast you looked at it. The letter was 2 paragraphs. Silas had a talent for efficiency when efficiency served him. The first paragraph informed her that the mortgage note on her father's general store in Black Hollow had been formally called due. Since she had vacated the premises without legal notice, any claim she might have had to negotiate terms had been forfeited. The store now belonged to Granger Holdings. This was stated as fact without apology, which was the honest approach at least. The second paragraph was the one that made her hand go still on the paper. It stated that a complaint had been filed with the county land office in Denver regarding certain mining claims registered in the name of Wyatt Blackridge on the North Ridge, alleging improper documentation and potential encroachment on federal territory. The matter was under review. Given the serious nature of the allegation, a federal land agent would be dispatched to investigate within 60 days. Clara read the second paragraph 3 times. Then she put the letter face down on the table and sat for a moment with her hands folded on top of it, very still. The way she used to sit when she was working through a set of numbers that refused to balance, and she needed to find the error before she could move forward. Silas couldn't touch her on this mountain. Wyatt had been right about that. So Silas was going after the mountain itself. She heard Wyatt's boots on the step outside, and the door opened and he came in with cold air and the smell of pine on him, and he looked at her face and stopped. "What happened?" he said. She turned the letter over and pushed it across the table. He read it standing up, still in his coat. She watched his face. He was hard to read at the best of times. The years alone had compressed his expressions down to the minimum required for communication, which meant that what showed was usually significant. What she saw working across his face now was not panic and not anger exactly. It was the particular quality of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion he was hoping was wrong. "You knew this was coming," she said. "I knew something was coming." He set the letter down. "Not this specifically. Your claim documentation," Clara said. "Is it sound? The original filing is 20 years old. Territorial, not federal. When Colorado achieved statehood, there was a period where old territorial claims had to be re-registered under the new federal standards. A lot of miners didn't do it. They didn't know they had to." He paused. "I didn't know I had to." Clara felt the specific cold that had nothing to do with temperature. "Tell me exactly what you filed and when," she said. He told her. She asked him questions for the next hour, precise and rapid, and he answered each one with the same precision, and at the end of it she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked at him. "It can be fixed," she said, "but not from up here. You'd need to go to Denver, in person. With the original territorial documents, which you have, and a formal re-registration application, and someone who can argue the case to the land office that the non-registration was an administrative oversight rather than an intentional violation." "A lawyer," Wyatt said. "A lawyer," Clara confirmed. "A good one. Not a black hollow lawyer. Granger owns half of them." "Denver. That takes money. You have money." "Not as much as I had 3 weeks ago," he said, and there was something dry in his voice that wasn't quite humor but was in the neighborhood of it. "Wyatt," she looked at him directly, "I need you to understand something. Silas isn't filing this complaint because he thinks your claim is actually invalid. He's filing it because he knows it'll cost you time and money and legal difficulty, and he's hoping you'll decide it's easier to settle with him quietly than fight a federal land case." "I understand that." And he looked at her. "And I'm not settling with Silas Granger quietly." He said it the same way he said most things, without drama, without volume, with the immovable certainty of a man who has made a decision on a foundation that is not going to shift. "What I need to know is whether the case can be won." "Yes," Clara said without hesitation, "it can be won. The law on territorial claim conversion is clear, and there's precedent. The problem is navigating the paperwork and making the argument before the land agent arrives, so the investigation starts from a position of documentation rather than a position of accusation." He nodded slowly. "How long to prepare everything you'd need?" "A week, maybe less if you can get me the original territorial filing documents today." "I can get them in an hour." "Then get them," Clara said. "And while you're doing that, I'm going to write a very detailed letter to a lawyer in Denver named Harlan Price, who handled my mother's estate and who is one of the few people I know for certain that Silas Granger has not managed to purchase." Wyatt had his coat back on before she'd finished the sentence. He was gone for 45 minutes. He came back with a flat tin box that he set on the table in front of her and opened. Inside were documents, carefully preserved, despite everything, organized in a way that told her he'd known exactly where they were for 20 years and had never touched them carelessly. She went to work. She worked for the next 6 days with the focused, absolute attention of a woman who understands that the papers in front of her are not abstract. They are a man's livelihood and a mountain that has been his only, and, quietly under all of that, the possibility of a future she hasn't let herself think about too directly yet, because the present still requires everything she has. Wyatt worked alongside her in his own way, retrieving documents, confirming dates, providing information, disappearing for hours into the cold to do the physical work the cabin and the claim required, and returning with the steady reliability of a man who has never once in 7 years failed to come back from what he set out to do. He brought her coffee without being asked. He made sure the fire didn't drop. He did not ask her how it was going, because he could see how it was going, and he had learned early that Clara Whitmore did not require management. On the third day she found the discrepancy. She almost missed it. It was buried in the original territorial filing, in a section describing the eastern boundary of the claim, where the description of a landmark, a specific rock formation used as a survey marker, matched the description of a formation that appeared in a different filing. A filing made by a company called Black Hollow Mining and Land Associates Incorporated 6 years ago. Clara sat very still and looked at both documents for a long time. Then she went to Wyatt's storage area and found the box of old assay records she'd cataloged in her first week and pulled 3 specific years and brought them back to the table and started cross-referencing. An hour later she sat back and said, "To nobody in particular, you son of a gun." Wyatt looked up from the harness he was repairing. "What? Black Hollow Mining and Land Associates," she said. "Do you know that company?" "I've heard the name. They've been buying up claims in the valley." "Why? Because they filed a claim on the south face of the North Ridge 6 years ago, using a survey description that overlaps with yours by approximately 40 acres. She turned the papers toward him. "And Black Hollow Mining and Land Associates is incorporated in Denver, but its primary investor, based on the public filing records I can access through the territorial registry, is listed as a holding company called Granger Capital." The harness went still in Wyatt's hands. "Silas Granger," he said, "has had an overlapping claim on my land for 6 years. "He's been waiting," Clara said. "He filed it 6 years ago and sat on it, because there was no reason to push it as long as you were just a quiet miner nobody paid attention to." "But now he has a reason," Wyatt said. His voice was very quiet. "Me," Clara said. "He's doing this because of me. Because you paid my father's debt and filed that contract and he can't touch me directly, so he's going after you." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "Wyatt, this is my fault." "No." He said it immediately, without hesitation. "This is Silas Granger's fault. The way it's always been his fault. He finds what people care about and he goes after it." "That's not your fault. That's just what he is." She looked at him. "You care about this mountain," she said. "Yes, and he figured that out. Men like him always figure that out." He set the harness down. He looked at the document spread across the table, at 6 years of deliberate strategy laid bare by a woman who knew how to read the language of numbers and legal filings, and the particular grammar of how a predatory man constructs his traps. "Can we fight it?" "Not just fight it," Clara said slowly. And something was happening in her mind now. The way it happened when numbers started resolving into a pattern, when the chaos of figures suddenly revealed an underlying logic. "Wyatt, his claim is fraudulent. It has to be the survey description he filed overlaps yours by 40 acres, which means either the surveyor made an error, which is possible, but I don't believe it, or someone deliberately filed a fraudulent boundary description. If it's fraudulent, then filing it constitutes a federal land fraud offense." The silence in the cabin changed quality. "You can prove that," Wyatt said. "It wasn't a question. I can prove the overlap," Clara said. "The fraud requires a lawyer and a federal court, but the overlap alone," she looked up at him. "Wyatt, the overlap alone is enough to flip this entire situation. He filed the complaint with the land office to put you on the defensive. But if we file first with the overlap evidence, then the investigation becomes about his fraudulent claim, not about your administrative oversight." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind had come up, rattling the cabin's single window in its frame, and the fire shifted and settled. And in the uneven light, Wyatt Blackridge looked like what he was, a large and solitary man who had spent 7 years believing that the mountain was the only thing he could hold on to, looking at a woman who had just found the means to let him keep it. "How many men do you think Silas has done this to?" he said quietly. "Other miners." Clara looked at the documents. "Potentially dozens. If this is his pattern file, a fraudulent overlap, sit on it, use it as leverage when you need something from someone, then there could be other claims in that registry that show the same signature." "Then we pull them all," Wyatt said. She looked up. "Every fraudulent filing he's made," he said. "We document all of them. We don't just defend my claim." We give the land office enough to open a full investigation. He held her gaze. You said you could do this. I said I could prove the overlap on yours. Can you find the others? Clara thought about it. Really thought about it, not reflexively, not to be reassuring, but with the honest accounting she gave everything. I'd need access to the Denver Land Registry, all of it. Which means someone would have to go to Denver with the specific filing numbers and request the records. I'll go. It'll take at least 2 weeks, maybe 3. I know, and while you're gone, you'll stay here, he said. You'll be safe. Granger's men don't come up in force and they know it. He paused. I'll leave you enough food for a month. You've got the rifle. You know how to use it. You've never actually confirmed that, Clara said. Can you use it? Yes. Then I've confirmed it, he said simply. She looked at him. Wyatt, Denver is a hard ride even in good weather. It's February. It's been worse February up here, he said. At least in Denver there are walls. That's not what I meant. She stopped. She hadn't meant the weather, not really. She'd meant the 2 weeks. She'd meant the cabin without him in it. She hadn't meant to mean that, and she wasn't going to say it. But something of it must have shown in her face because he went still across the table, and his eyes moved over her face with the careful attention of a man reading terrain he doesn't want to misread. I'll be back, he said. I know, she said, which was true, because she did know she knew it with the unreasonable certainty of a person who has started organizing their understanding of the world around someone else's reliability without fully consenting to do so. He left 3 days later, early before full light. Clara was up before him. She had packed supplies for the ride she'd spent the previous evening doing it, without telling him she was going to. And when he came out in the dark and saw the packed saddlebags on the table, he stood looking at them for a moment, and then looked at her. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. He picked up the saddlebags. He stood for a moment with them in his hands, and Clara stood by the table, and they were 6 feet apart in a dark cabin at 5 in the morning, and something was very loud in the space between them that neither of them was going to say. The east wall stovepipe has a loose fitting, he said. If you hear rattling in a wind, check it before the fire gets too high. I will. There's an extra axe in the shed, the regular one. I found the crack in the handle 3 days ago. I've been using the extra one. He stopped, UF. He looked at her, she looked at him. And then he put on his hat, and he walked to the door, and he stopped with his hand on the latch. Clara, he said without turning. A pause. Don't let the fire go out. She understood that he was not talking about the stove. I won't, she said. He left. The cabin was very quiet for a long time after. She stood in the middle of it and let herself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, everything she had been refusing to feel, and then she sat down at the table and opened the land registry notes and went back to work. Because that was who she was, and that was how she handled things, and the documents were not going to file themselves. The first week was fine. She had work and routine, and the particular company of a quiet place that has been lived in, long enough to hold the shape of the person who lives there, the worn spot on the floor, where he stood to pour coffee, the hook by the door at exactly his height, the way the cot in her room was positioned to catch the morning light, because he had built the cabin knowing where the sun rose. She was not lonely, she was alone, which is different. On the 8th day the fever started. She didn't recognize it at first as something serious. She'd been cold. Everyone was cold in February at altitude, and she'd been working long hours by lamplight, and the slight headache and the chill she couldn't quite shake seemed like nothing a good night's sleep wouldn't address. By the 9th day she knew it was something. By the 10th day she was genuinely frightened, which was not a state Clara Whitmore arrived at, easily or quickly. The fever had climbed and she was having trouble keeping water down, and her head felt like it had been packed with wet wool. And she lay on the cot in her room and looked at the ceiling, and ran through her options with the methodical determination of a woman who has learned that panic is a luxury she cannot afford. The options were ride down the mountain in her current condition, on trails that were icy and steep, which would almost certainly result in a fall that would kill her. Send for help, which was not possible since there was nobody to send. Or wait. She waited. She got up to feed the fire every few hours because she had promised she wouldn't let it go out, and she was, above all things, a woman who kept her word. She forced water. She ate what she could, which was not much. She slept in the long, ragged way of someone whose sleep is not rest, and she woke shaking, and she got up and fed the fire and went back to bed. On the 12th day she heard the horse. She heard it before she heard anything else, the particular sound of hooves on the frozen ground of the clearing. And she lay still and listened and told herself it was probably nothing, that she was not in the condition to manage the kind of hope she felt. And then she heard boots on the step, and the door opened, and it was Wyatt. He came through the door and stopped. He took one look at her, standing in the doorway of her room, wrapped in a blanket with a fever she'd stopped trying to hide from herself, and his face did something she had never seen it do. Not concern, something beyond concern. Something that moved through his expression the way weather moves, fast and total, and changing everything it passes over. He crossed the cabin in 3 steps. How long? He said. 9 days, she said, and her voice came out, wrong, thin and cracked. She hadn't realized until she heard it out loud. Why didn't you? He stopped himself. He knew as well as she did that there was nowhere to send and nobody to send to. He put one hand to her forehead and then to her cheek, and the warmth of his palm against the cold of her skin was so immediate and so overwhelming that she had to press her lips together very hard. Sit down, he said. I'm fine, Clara. His voice was very quiet and very serious. Sit down. She sat down. He had come back 3 days earlier than planned, which she was going to ask about when she was not using everything. She had to sit upright in a chair, without the room spinning. He built the fire high and put water to boil, and went through her supplies with quick, efficient assessment, and then he started cooking, not the kind of minimalist camp cooking he'd been doing for 7 years, but something deliberate. Something she recognized as a man doing the specific work of taking care. The same work she had done for him in those first weeks returned now at significant interest. She watched him from the chair. What did you find in Denver? She said. 7 other claims, he said, without turning from the fire. All with the same signature, same survey company, same boundary description methodology. He paused. The lawyer Price, the one you told me about. He's filing the complaint to the Federal Land Office this week. With all 8 claims documented, he turned and looked at her. Silas Kinsgranger is not having a good month. Something that wanted to be a laugh moved through Clara's chest and came out as a cough instead. Wyatt was across the room and had his hand on her back before she'd finished. Easy, he said. I'm fine, she said again, which was becoming less convincing the more she said it. You have a fever. You've been alone for 12 days on a mountain in February, and you've been getting up every few hours to feed a fire instead of resting because you promised you'd keep it going. He said it plainly, not reproachfully, just stating the facts as he found them. That's not fine. That's just surviving, which is different. She looked up at him. He was very close in the way the cabin imposed. Close in the way of a man who has just come back from a hard 2-week ride and found something worth coming back to and is standing next to it with the specific care of a person who has learned not to take fragile things for granted. You came back early, she said. Yes, why? He looked at her for a moment. His hand was still on her back, warm and steady through the blanket. Because I wanted to, just that. No elaboration, no performance. Because I wanted to, the simplest possible answer, said by a man who had spent 7 years doing only what was necessary for survival and had apparently decided, somewhere on a road between here and Denver, that wanting something was a reason that counted. Clara looked at her hands. The fire, she said quietly. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said, the fire. He fed her. He made her drink more water than she thought she could manage. He sat with her through the night, not in the adjacent room, but in the main room with the door open so he could hear her breathe, and she heard him moving quietly out there, the sound of wood being added to the fire, the sound of coffee being made in the slow dark hour way, and she lay on the cot and thought that this was what it felt like to not be alone, truly, not as a concept or a memory but as a present, actual fact. By the morning her fever had broken. She knew because she woke up clear-headed for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, and the ceiling of her room was simply the ceiling and not something moving. And when she sat up, she did not have to grip the edge of the cot to keep the room from sliding. She came out to the main room. Wyatt was at the table. He had the land registry documents spread in front of him, and he was going through them with the focused attention of a man who has learned how to read a new language and is testing how far his understanding goes. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her face. "Better," he said. "Better," she confirmed. "Sit down." "I've been lying down for 12 days. Then sit down, which is different from lying down." She sat down. He poured coffee and put it in front of her and sat back across the table, and they looked at each other across the documents and the lamp and the accumulated weight of the past 3 weeks. "The lawyer in Denver," Clara said. "What did he say about timeline?" 6 months, maybe 8, for a full federal investigation. But he paused. He said the complaint filing itself changes things. Once a federal complaint is on record, Granger can't move on any of the claims he's got disputed, which means he can't sell the land he was planning to sell. Which means the financing on a project he's been building in the valley falls apart. Wyatt looked at her steadily. "Price says Granger is going to feel this within the month. Financially, Clara absorbed that he'll retaliate. Probably, he'll come after something. He'll try," Wyatt said. "He won't find much to grab onto." He paused. "Price also told me something else. About your father's store." Clara went still. "The mortgage Silas called due," Wyatt said. Price looked at the original contract, the one your father signed. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document and set it on the table between them. "There's a clause, a standard one for commercial properties in Colorado at the time. It says that in the event of the primary borrower's death, the mortgage cannot be accelerated, called due immediately, without a 60-day notice period sent to any surviving family members at their last known address." Clara looked at the document. "He didn't give 60 days, she said. "He gave 3, Wyatt said. "He came to the store 3 days after your father's funeral." "The notice," Clara said slowly. "He would have had to send written notice to my address, the store." "Did he send written notice?" "Price says there's no record of it." "Because he didn't send it." Clara's voice was very quiet. "He came in person and expected to collect in a different way. And when that didn't work, he just declared the mortgage called due, without following the legal process. Which means," Wyatt said, "that the foreclosure on your father's store is procedurally invalid." The room was very quiet. "It means the store might still be mine," Clara said. "It means Price is filing a second complaint," Wyatt said. "Wrongful foreclosure. And given that the same man is now under federal investigation for land fraud." He stopped. He looked at her. Silas Granger picked the wrong people to go after. Clara sat with that for a long moment. She thought about the morning she'd left the key on the counter. The deliberate act of letting go, of accepting a loss she'd believed was final. And now sitting across from a man who had ridden to Denver and back in February weather, and come home with not just a defense but a counterattack, and who was watching her with eyes that held no triumph, no "I told you so," just the quiet certainty of someone who had decided she was worth fighting for, and had gone ahead and done the fighting. "You did all of this," she said. "We did all of this," he said. "Your numbers found the fraud. I just carried them somewhere they could do damage." She looked at her coffee cup. She looked at the documents. She looked at Wyatt Blackridge across a pine table on a mountain in February, this man who had been alone for so long that he'd forgot what it felt like to want something for himself, and who was looking back at her with something in his expression that was careful and certain, and very nearly, almost the beginning of brave. "You said you came back early because you wanted to," she said. "Yes, what did you want?" He was quiet for a moment. A long one. The fire was steady behind him. Outside the snow had stopped, and the day was brilliantly cold and clear in the way of winter mornings after storms, when everything is precise and lit and there are no shadows anywhere. "You," he said, just that word. One syllable, said by a man who doesn't waste words, which meant it was everything. Clara looked at him. And for the first time since she'd left Black Hollow with her pack and her father's apron and her mother's brooch and nothing else, she let herself feel the full weight of where she was and who was across from her and what had been quietly, steadily, irreversibly building in this cabin for weeks, and she did not look away from it. "Okay," she said. "He bloke." "Okay," she said again, and the corner of her mouth moved, and Wyatt Blackridge, who had not smiled in longer than he could account for, felt something in his chest shift and resettle in a way it hadn't in 7 years. Outside, the mountain was clean and white and utterly still. Inside, the fire burned. The word "okay" sat between them for the rest of that morning, like something newly planted, small, fragile, requiring careful handling, and containing within it everything that the previous weeks had been moving toward, without either of them being willing to say so directly. Neither Wyatt nor Clara made a performance of it. That was not who they were. What changed was subtler than that, and more substantial, a kind of permission, granted and received without ceremony, to stop pretending that what was happening between them was only professional, only practical. Only two people sharing a cabin out of necessity and mutual convenience. The work continued, the documents continued. Harlan Price sent letters from Denver every week, each one containing updates that moved like a slow landslide gradually, then all at once. The federal complaint regarding Silas Granger's fraudulent land filings had been formally accepted for investigation by the Denver Land Office. 3 other miners on the North Ridge had been contacted, all of whom had overlapping claims filed against them by Black Hollow Mining and Land Associates, all of whom had been unaware of it until Price's letter arrived. 2 of them rode up the mountain to talk to Wyatt directly, arriving on a cold March afternoon with hard faces and harder questions, and Clara sat at the table and showed them the documents while Wyatt stood by the fire. And by the time they left 2 hours later, they had signed on to Price's consolidated complaint, and one of them, a grizzled man named Abe Colton, who had been mining the ridge for 15 years, had shaken Clara's hand and said, "You're the one who found this." "We found it," Clara said. Abe Colton looked from her to Wyatt and back again, and something knowing and uncomplicated moved across his weathered face. "Sure you did," he said pleasantly, and put on his hat and left. Wyatt looked at Clara after the door closed. "He thinks," Clara started. "Yes," Wyatt said, a pause. "Are we?" Clara said. She asked it plainly, the way she did everything, because she had learned young that dancing around a direct question cost more than it saved. Wyatt looked at her for a moment. He was leaning against the wall by the fire, arms crossed, in the posture he took when he was thinking something through, and he thought it through now, with the thoroughness he gave everything. "I'd like us to be," he said. "Then we are," Clara said, and went back to the documents. It took a moment, and then Wyatt made a sound she had never heard from him before, low and quiet and unmistakably genuine, something that on another man would have been a laugh, and on him was something rarer and more valuable than that. She didn't look up, she let him have it privately. But she felt the warmth of it across the room, and the corner of her mouth moved, and she kept writing. March became April. The snow on the trail down to Black Hollow retreated from the main path first, then from the switchbacks, then from the lower meadow, and one morning Clara stood in the cabin doorway and smelled something she had nearly forgotten: mud. The specific smell of earth releasing from frost, of things beginning again under the surface where you couldn't see them yet. She stood there for a long moment, breathing it in, and then she went back inside and sat down across from Wyatt at the breakfast table and said, "I want to go back down." He looked up. "Not permanently," she said. "Not yet." But Price's last letter said the Land Office investigation is moving to a formal hearing phase, which means someone needs to be in Black Hollow to gather testimony from local residents who've had dealings with Granger's businesses. People who've been underpaid, overcharged, misled on contracts. She paused. "They'll talk to me before they'll talk to a lawyer from Denver they've never met." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Granger still has men in town." "I know. He's going to be less than pleased to see you walk back in." "I know that too." She met his gaze steadily. "He knows the investigation is happening. He doesn't know the full scope of what we have yet." The element of surprise is mostly gone, but the testimony piece, that's something that has to happen in person, and I'm the person best positioned to do it." She paused. "And there's the store. The store." The wrongful foreclosure complaint Price had filed in February had moved through the first stage of review and been upheld. The procedural violations were clear enough that the county judge had issued a preliminary order requiring Granger to show cause why the foreclosure should not be reversed. The hearing was in 6 weeks. Clara needed to be present. "I'm coming with you," Wyatt said. "You don't have to." Clara, just her name, the way he said it, quiet and absolute, the way you'd say a thing you're very certain of. She looked at him. "I'm coming with you," he said again. She nodded once. Okay, they rode down the mountain 4 days later, on a morning when the light was the particular pale gold of early spring at altitude and the air had the first real hint of warmth in it. The kind that makes animals come out and stand in it like they can't quite believe it's back. Clara rode her father's old mare, which Wyatt had retrieved from the livery in Black Hollow on his February trip to Denver quietly, without telling her, and which had been stabled in his shed through the rest of winter, and was now noticeably better fed and better tempered than Clara remembered. She noticed the horse's condition on the first morning, and hadn't said anything to Wyatt about it. She had simply put her hand on the mare's neck and stood there for a moment, and Wyatt had walked past to saddle his own horse, and not said anything either, and that was the whole of it, which was somehow exactly right. Black Hollow in early April looked the same as it always had, which was both more and less than Clara expected. She had been gone since February. In those 2 months her father had been buried, her store had been taken, she had lived through a fever on a mountain and a federal complaint, and a man saying "you" in a dark cabin and meaning everything by it, and the town looked the same. The same muddy Main Street, the same sign above the saloon with the faded paint. The same people going about their business in the careful peripheral way that small towns move when something complicated has been happening in their midst. People noticed her. She saw it in the way conversations shifted slightly when she passed, the way eyes moved from her to Wyatt riding beside her, and then away, the particular calibration of people trying to decide what they were looking at and what it meant for them. Wyatt rode like he was comfortable being looked at, which was to say he rode like he didn't particularly care whether he was or not, straight and unhurried, and people generally got out of the way of him as a matter of physical common sense. They went to Price's local associate first, a young lawyer named Cobb, who had an office above the hardware store and who received them with the nervous energy of a man who understood that the case he was part of was significantly larger than anything else in his career to date. He reviewed the status of the foreclosure challenge with Clara, while Wyatt sat in the corner of the small office and listened with his arms crossed, and the particular quality of alertness that Clara had come to recognize as his version of paying close attention. "The hearing is the 14th, Cobb said. Judge Alderman. He's honest he was appointed before Granger had the current sheriff in his pocket, which is the important thing. The preliminary ruling in our favor is solid. Granger's lawyers will argue that the notice requirement was met through general knowledge that you knew the debt existed and the store was collateral, so formal notice was technically redundant." "That's not what the statute says," Clara said. "No," Cobb agreed. "It isn't, but they'll make the argument. Granger has 2 Denver lawyers coming in for the hearing." "Good ones. Then we'd better have everything tight," Clara said. She spent the next 2 weeks in Black Hollow with the focused, systematic purpose that had always been her best quality. She talked to people. Not grandly, not with speeches. She sat with them in their kitchens and their back rooms, and she listened, and she asked questions, and she showed them documents when documents were relevant, and she wrote down what they told her. Margaret Hale, who had run the boarding house for 20 years, who had a loan with Granger's lending operation at an interest rate that didn't match the original contract she'd signed, who had been afraid to say anything because she had no proof and no power. Jonas Prentice, the blacksmith, whose supply contract with the Granger lumberyard had a penalty clause in the fine print that he'd never been told about, and had been paying for 3 years without knowing why his margins never added up. Delia Foster, who had been a bookkeeper for one of Granger's businesses for 8 years before she was dismissed without cause, when she started asking questions about a set of accounts that didn't reconcile. Delia Foster became the most important one. Clara found her on a Thursday afternoon, living in a small house on the east side of town with her sister's family. She was a small, precise woman in her 40s with the specific kind of careful composure of someone who has been frightened for a long time and learned to wear calm over the top of it. She received Clara in the front room with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes watchful. "I heard you were back," Delia said. "I'm back," Clara confirmed. "Mrs. Foster, I read the accounts you were working on." Price in Denver obtained copies through the federal investigation. Delia went very still. "You documented everything," Clara said quietly. "Before you were dismissed. The discrepancies, the double billing, the false expense reports." She paused. "You documented everything, and someone found it before you could do anything with it. And that's why you were dismissed." Something moved through Delia Foster's composure, a crack, brief and quickly controlled, but Clara saw it. "I couldn't prove anything," Delia said. "You could," Clara said. "You can. The federal investigation has the authority to subpoena the accounts directly. But they need someone who worked inside those books to explain what the numbers mean. Someone who knows where to look. If I testify, Granger will know it was you." "Yes." Clara didn't soften it. "I won't pretend otherwise." "He'll know, and he'll be angry." She leaned forward slightly. "But Mrs. Foster, the investigation is already moving. The land fraud case alone is going to cost him significantly. The question is whether the financial crimes are exposed at the same time, and that depends on whether someone who knows those books is willing to stand up and explain them." The room was quiet for a long moment. "He took everything from me," Delia said. Her voice was very controlled. "My position, my reputation in this town. I couldn't get work anywhere in Black Hollow after he dismissed me. Everyone assumed I'd done something wrong." She paused. "I have a letter," she said. Clara waited. "I kept a copy of a letter," Delia said. "When I realized what I was looking at in those books, I wrote it all down, what I found. The specific accounts, the amounts, the dates, and I sent the original to the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver and kept a copy hidden here." She looked at Clara steadily. "Nobody ever came then," Clara said quietly. "They'll come now." Delia Foster uncrossed her hands from her lap. She stood up. She went to the back of the house and was gone for several minutes, and when she came back she was carrying a folded document wrapped in oilskin. She set it on the table in front of Clara. "I want it on record," Delia said, "that I tried to report this 8 years ago." "It will be," Clara said. "I'll make sure Price documents it personally." She brought the letter back to the room above the hardware store that evening, where Wyatt was waiting. He read it standing at the window with the last of the daylight, and when he set it down, he looked at Clara with an expression she was still learning the full vocabulary of. "8 years," he said. 8 years she's been sitting on that," Clara said. Afraid, alone, she pressed her lips together. "He does that. He makes people feel like they're the only ones, like nobody else saw what they saw, like speaking up would just be them alone against all of it. But they're not alone. They've never been alone. There are a dozen people in this town who have pieces of this, and they've each been sitting with their piece in the dark, thinking they're the only one." "Until now," Wyatt said. "Until now," Clara agreed. He looked at her for a moment. "You're good at this," he said. "Getting people to talk, getting them to trust you." "I grew up in a general store," Clara said. "People talk to the person behind the counter. They always have. They tell you things because you're not threatening and you're not leaving town and you'll still be there tomorrow." She paused. "I just listened better than my father did." Something moved through Wyatt's eyes, something warm and complicated and entirely genuine. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, close, and he reached out and tucked a loose strand of heather back from her face with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been wanting to do that for some time and has finally allowed himself to. She looked up at him. "What happens after the hearing?" he said. "Depending on the ruling, either we get the store back or we appeal." She paused. Either way, Granger's going to be tied up in federal proceedings for the better part of a year. He's not going to have the bandwidth to come after either of us directly. That's not what I'm asking, Wyatt said. She knew it wasn't. I don't know, she said honestly. What do you want to happen? He thought about it for a moment, seriously. The way he thought about everything. I want to come down from the mountain more, he said. Not permanently, but more. He paused. I've been up there long enough. Long enough that I forgot there were things worth coming down for. The cabin stays. It's mine and it'll stay mine. He looked at her steadily. But a man doesn't need to live like a hermit, just because he's been through bad things. I think I convinced myself that was the only safe option. Stay up there. Don't want anything. Don't give anything a chance to go wrong. He paused. That was wrong. Clara looked at him. I had to nearly lose the mountain for you to figure that out, she said. No, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. I figured it out the day I walked into your store. She held was the day you met me. Yes, he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. This man. This impossible, enormous, careful guard man who had given away a year's gold for a principle, and spent 7 years on a mountain learning to live without softness, and had walked back into the world of people with that left pouch in his hand and some deep and reliable instinct that she was someone worth walking toward. Wyatt, she said. Yeah. Stop talking, she said, and she closed the distance between them and put her hand against his jaw. And he went very still for one moment, the stillness of a man who has been alone a long time and is relearning that being touched can be something other than a threat. And then he put both arms around her with the careful, deliberate certainty of a man who does nothing halfway, and held on. They stayed like that for a long time, in a room above a hardware store in Black Hollow, Colorado, with the investigation and the hearing and Silas Granger's lawyers and the federal land office and all of it waiting outside the window. And none of it, for that specific moment, mattering at all. The hearing was on the 14th of April. Judge Alderman's courtroom was the largest room in the county building, which was not saying much. It seated perhaps 60 people and had a ceiling that leaked when it rained and 2 windows that stuck in their frames. It was full. Clara had not expected it to be full. She had expected the usual sparse attendance that legal proceedings drew in a town where most people had enough of their own trouble without attending someone else's. Instead, she walked in and found every seat taken. Margaret Hale was there, Jonas Prentice, Delia Foster in the front row, with her back straight and her hands folded and her quiet composure worn like armor. Abe Colton from the North Ridge, with 2 other miners she didn't know by name. Half a dozen people she recognized from years of running the store counter. A man in the back she had never seen, who she would later learn was a correspondent for the Denver newspaper. Wyatt walked in beside her. The room registered him. People shifted, made space, the way people do around someone whose physical presence is simply that, a presence, undeniable, a fact of the room. Silas Granger was already at the plaintiff's table with his 2 Denver lawyers. He looked, for the first time in Clara's experience of him, slightly uncertain. Not frightened, she doubted Silas was capable of frightened in any straightforward way, but calibrating. The way a man recalculates when he realizes the room he's walked into is larger than he expected. He looked at Clara when she entered. She looked back. She did not look away first. Granger's lawyer led with the argument Cobb had predicted the notice requirement was a technicality. Clara's awareness of the debt constituted constructive notice. The foreclosure was valid in substance if not in precise procedural form. It was a competent argument delivered by a competent man, and it took 40 minutes. Cobb presented the statutory language in response. It took 12 minutes because the statutory language was clear, and clarity doesn't require elaboration. Then the judge asked Granger's lawyer a question that neither Clara nor Cobb had anticipated. He asked when precisely the formal notice had been sent. Not whether it had been sent, when. Because the judge had in front of him a certified record from the Black Hollow Postal Service showing that no certified mail had been sent from Granger Holdings to any address in Black Hollow in the 7. Days following Owen Whitmore's recorded date of death. The courtroom was very quiet. Granger's lawyer said something about alternative forms of notice. The judge said that the statute did not provide for alternative forms. At the plaintiff's table, Silas Granger's jaw tightened fractionally. Clara watched it happen from across the room. She watched the precise moment when a man who had operated for decades on the assumption that the machinery he'd built around himself would absorb any challenge registered that the machinery had a piece missing, and the piece wasn't coming back. The ruling came at 3 in the afternoon. Foreclosure reversed. Store returned to the estate of Owen Whitmore, and as his surviving heir, to Clara Whitmore. Costs to the plaintiff. The room exhaled. Margaret Hale made a sound that might have been a prayer, or might have been the beginning of a cry. Delia Foster sat perfectly still with her eyes closed for 10 seconds, and then she opened them and looked at Clara and nodded once, and Clara nodded back. Wyatt beside her said nothing. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder just for a moment. Not for the room. Not for anyone watching. Just because he was there and she was there, and it had gone the right way, and then took it back. Granger left the courtroom without looking at anyone. His lawyers followed. The Denver newspaper correspondent was scribbling. The room slowly released and rearranged itself into the social chaos of people who have just witnessed something and need to talk about it. Clara stood in the middle of it and felt something she didn't immediately have a word for, not triumph, because triumph is loud and this was quiet. Not relief, because relief implies the fear is over, and she was experienced enough to know that a man like Silas Granger did not simply stop. But something. The specific weight of a thing that had been pressing down for months lifting by 1 degree, and the understanding that the lifting had come not from luck or accident but from work, from her work, and Wyatt's work. And Delia Foster's 8 years of patient documentation, and all the pieces of it that had come together the way things come together, when people who have been alone stop being alone. She felt Wyatt's presence beside her. She turned to look at him. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "What now?" He looked around the room at the people, at the window where Granger had gone, at the ceiling and its leak-stained plaster. He seemed to be taking a complete accounting of everything, the way he did with his mountains and his mining claims, and everything else he gave his attention to. "I think," he said, "that we go see the store." They went. It was strange, walking back through the door of her father's store, with the key that Cobb had retrieved from Granger's office under court order. The store had been locked since February. 2 months of winter and vacancy had left it cold and stale-aired, and filmed with the particular dust of a closed space. The inventory was mostly intact. Granger hadn't moved it, apparently calculating that the store itself was the asset worth taking, not its contents. Her father's ledger was still on the shelf where she'd left it. She stood in the middle of it. Wyatt stood beside her. "It needs work," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "The window still needs replacing." "I can fix that." She looked at him. "You're going to help me fix a window?" "I can fix a window," he said with slight dignity. "I built an entire cabin." "You built a cabin that you described to me as functional." "Windows were functional," she laughed. She laughed in the store where 3 months ago she'd stood with a cast-iron skillet and 2 men between her and everything, and the laugh was genuine and full and completely unlike the thin surprise sound she'd made in the cabin weeks ago. This was the laugh of a woman who has come all the way through something and is standing on the other side of it, not unscathed but intact, and knows the difference. Wyatt watched her laugh with an expression that she was fairly certain was the closest thing to happiness she'd ever seen on his face. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, when she'd settled. Something in his voice shifted the quality of the moment. She looked at him. "I talked to Price in Denver," he said. "About the consolidated complaint, the land fraud case. He thinks it's going to go well. But he also thinks it's going to take time, and during that time, Granger is going to be looking for ways to reduce the scope of the charges. Price expects him to try to settle some of the smaller cases privately, pressure individual miners to drop their complaints in exchange for leaving their claims alone. He can't do that if they're part of a federal investigation," Clara said. "He can't do it legally," Wyatt said, "but Granger doesn't operate legally. He operates through pressure and isolation, and making people feel like they're alone. He looked at her steadily. Which is why Price thinks the miners on the ridge need to formalize their arrangement. Not just as witnesses in a complaint, but as a legal entity, a collective. An association with joint filing rights and a shared legal representative, so that Granger can't pick them off one at a time. That's smart, Clara said. Price drafted the paperwork already. He paused. He named me as the organizing member. I need to go back up the ridge and talk to Abe Colton and the others. He paused again. And I need to ask you something. She waited. The association needs a secretary, he said. Someone to maintain the records, the filings, the correspondence. He looked at her with the steady, direct gaze that she'd learned meant he was saying something important without decoration. Someone who knows land law and account books, and how to read a legal document and how to talk to people who are frightened into thinking they're alone. You're asking me to be the secretary of a miners' association, Clara said. I'm asking you to be the thing that makes the association actually work, he said. Which is different from the title. He paused. It would mean being here. In town. Running the store, because you'll need an income that isn't dependent on what happens with my claim. And working the association matters out of here. He looked around the store. Building something. Clara looked at him. You'd be down in town, she said. More, I said. I wanted to come down more. He held her gaze. I meant it, and up on the ridge, I'd be where I need to be, he said. Working my claim, which is what I know how to do. And I'd be down here whenever. He stopped. He started again. Whenever it made sense to be down here. He said it carefully, without pressure, without assumption, the way a man makes an offer that is genuinely an offer and not a demand wearing an offer's clothes. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the cabin. She thought about 2 months on a mountain with this man who ate cold food and kept a broken box under a canvas and had not allowed himself to want anything, because wanting things meant having them taken away. She thought about what he'd said: a man doesn't need to live like a hermit just because he's been through bad things. She thought about a store with a cracked window pane that had needed replacing for 3 years, and a ledger with her father's handwriting in it, and a town full of people who had all been sitting alone in the dark with their piece of Silas Granger's machinery, and had not yet discovered that the pieces fit together. She thought about what it meant to build something. She thought about Wyatt Blackridge, saying you in a dark cabin and meaning everything. Yes, she said. He went still. Yes, to which part? All of it, Clara said. The store, the association. You coming down more? She looked at him steadily. Yes, to all of it. He exhaled a long, slow breath that she realized he had been holding, probably since he started talking, possibly since February, possibly longer than that. Okay, he said. She recognized the word. She'd said it to him first weeks ago across a table. He was giving it back to her now, and it meant exactly as much coming from him as it had coming from her, which was everything. Delivered in a single syllable by 2 people who had learned the hard way that the simplest words are usually the truest ones. The window, she said after a moment. I'll get the glass tomorrow, he said. There's also the matter of the shelving on the east wall, she said. The second bracket from the left has been loose since. Clara, she stopped. He crossed the distance between them and stood in front of her, in the middle of her father's store, in the town where 3 months ago she'd had nothing and nobody, and a cast-iron skillet between her and disaster, and he looked at her with dark, steady eyes and said, the shelving will be there tomorrow. It will, so will the window. Yes. So will Silas Granger's lawyers and Price's filings and the association paperwork and all of it. He was very close now. It'll all be there tomorrow. What's your point, Wyatt? She said, but she was already smiling. My point, he said, is that right now, tonight, all of that can wait. He reached out and took her hand, both hands, both of hers in both of his, carefully, like something he'd been thinking about for a long time and was finally doing. We won today. Clara looked at their hands. She thought about her father's pickaxe and the wrong side of the mountain. She thought about the gold dust on the counter and the bell flying off the door. She thought about an elk carved into a pine and two people sitting across from each other in lamplight, learning the weight of each other's silences. She thought about a fever broken and a horse that came back better fed, and a lawyer in Denver with 7 fraudulent claims and a woman named Delia Foster who had waited 8 years to be believed. She thought about the particular kind of winning that isn't loud. That doesn't announce itself. That is simply the accumulation of days in which two people who had both been through enough to know better chose, again and again, to keep going toward the work, toward the truth, toward each other. "We won today," she agreed, and she held on to his hands, in the cold, dusty quiet of her father's store, as the afternoon light came through the cracked window pane and fell across the worn floor between them. And outside in Black Hollow the day went on being itself imperfect, complicated, and entirely, stubbornly, beautifully worth fighting for. The window got fixed on a Saturday. Wyatt rode down from the ridge with the new glass wrapped carefully in canvas across his saddlebag, which was not the most practical way to transport glass on a Tees Mountain trail, and he knew it. But he'd made it work through a combination of patience and the particular stubbornness that had kept him alive at altitude for 7 years. Clara heard the horse in the street and came to the door, and he held up the glass and she shook her head slowly like a woman who has accepted that this man is going to do things in the most complicated possible way and has made her peace with it. He replaced the pane in 40 minutes. He did it cleanly, without fuss, the way he did everything physical with the economy of someone who has spent years working alone, where doing a job twice means burning resources you may not have. Clara watched him from the counter, pretending to work on the association correspondence, and did not pretend very convincingly. When he finished, he stood back and looked at the window. The new glass was clearer than the old, and the afternoon light came through it, differently brighter, sharper. Without the distortion of the cracked pane that had been there so long, Clara had stopped seeing it as a flaw and simply accepted it as the way light worked in that room. "It's different," she said. "It's what it was supposed to look like," Wyatt said. She thought about that for a moment, longer than the statement strictly required. May came, then June. The store reopened the first week of May quietly, without announcement, because Clara decided that announcing it would feel like a performance, and she had no interest in performing. She simply unlocked the door on a Monday morning, put the open sign out, restocked the shelves with the inventory that had survived the winter, and waited. People came. Not everyone, some of them had made arrangements elsewhere during the closure and wouldn't shift back, and she didn't blame them. But enough came, and new people came, travelers and miners moving through the ridge country, who needed supplies and found a store that was run by a woman who knew exactly what everything cost and why, and was entirely willing to explain it. The association work happened in the back room, at a table she'd set up specifically for it. Price sent documents from Denver every 2 weeks. Clara processed them, drafted responses, maintained the filing system, and corresponded with the 7 other miners whose claims were part of the consolidated complaint. Abe Colton came by the store regularly, ostensibly for supplies, genuinely to check on progress, and the two of them developed the efficient shorthand of people who are working toward the same thing for different but compatible reasons. Delia Foster started working in the store on Wednesdays and Fridays. It had not been a formal offer. Clara had simply mentioned, one afternoon when Delia came in for thread, that the association correspondence was growing faster than one pair of hands could manage comfortably, and Delia had said she was available. And they had both understood that this was how it was going to go. Delia turned out to be faster with numbers than Clara had expected and more quietly tenacious, and within a month Clara had rearranged the work so that Delia handled the financial reconciliation and Clara handled the legal filings. And the system operated with the satisfying precision of two people whose skills happened to fit together without overlap. Wyatt came down from the ridge every week, sometimes twice. He stopped explaining it as having business in town. He simply came, and he sat at the counter and drank coffee, and occasionally he fixed something, the east wall shelf bracket that had been loose since before the winter, the hinge on the storage room door, a section of the store's front step that had developed a concerning flex underfoot. He did these things without being asked, noticed them apparently on his own, and completed them with the same quiet thoroughness he gave everything. The town watched. Black Hollow had opinions about most things, and Clara Whitmore and Wyatt Blackridge gave it material to work with. She heard things, the way you do when you've been behind a counter in a town since you were a child, fragments of conversation, the particular silence that falls when you walk into a room, the exaggerated normalcy of people pretending they haven't been talking about you. She let it move past her. She had learned a long time ago that a town's opinion of her situation was substantially less important than her actual situation. Wyatt, for his part, appeared to be entirely unaware that he was a subject of speculation, or was aware and had assessed it as not worth his attention, which amounted to the same result. He tipped his hat to people in the street with the same deliberate courtesy he gave everything, and he helped Jonas Prentice carry a delivery that was too heavy for one man without being asked. And he had a brief but apparently decisive conversation with two of Granger's former associates who had been making noise about the investigation that left them notably quieter afterward. And the town revised its understanding of him gradually from dangerous mountain stranger to something more complicated and more accurate. He was not a man who needed the town's approval. He was a man who had decided to be part of it anyway on terms he'd negotiated with himself, and there was a dignity in that people recognized even when they couldn't name it. It was on a Wednesday in late June that the federal letter arrived. Clara was in the back room with Delia when the mail came, brought over by the postal boy who had learned that Mrs. Whitmore's correspondence warranted actual delivery rather than waiting to be collected. She heard Delia take it from him, heard the quality of the silence that followed, and came to the doorway. Delia was holding an envelope with the seal of the United States Department of the Interior. She held it out without speaking. Clara took it. She turned it over once. She pressed her lips together in the way she had when she stood at her father's graveside and told herself she was not going to fall apart in front of strangers. She opened it. She read it again. Then she sat down on the stool behind the counter and set the letter flat on the wood in front of her and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Clara, Delia said quietly. They ruled, Clara said. On the land fraud case. Delia, all 8 claims, Clara said. Every fraudulent filing by Black Hollow Mining and Land Associates. The Federal Land Office has found in favor of the complainants on all counts. She paused. Silas Granger has been formally charged with federal land fraud. 7 counts. His assets in Colorado are frozen pending the criminal proceeding. She stopped. The Black Hollow Assay Office, the one that's been underpaying miners for years, has been ordered to undergo a full federal audit. The room was quiet, and Delia said, "The store isn't mentioned here." That was the county ruling. This is the federal one. Clara looked up. This is the one that finishes it. Delia sat down on the other stool. She put both hands flat on the counter. She was quiet for a long time, and Clara let her be, because she understood exactly what this moment was for Delia Foster. 8 years of being dismissed and discredited and afraid. And the letter sitting on the counter between them was the official record that she had been right all along. 8 years, Delia said. 8 years, Clara agreed. And you were right. Delia pressed her lips together. She nodded once, very precisely, the nod of a woman who has held it together through significantly more than this, and is going to hold it together through this too. Someone should tell Wyatt, she said. Clara was already reaching for her coat. She found him on the north side of the ridge, where he'd been working a new section of the claim since April. She rode up fast, and he heard the horse coming and came out to the trail to meet her, and one look at her face told him something significant had happened. He caught the mare's bridle and looked up at Clara. The federal ruling came, she said. He read it in her face before she said anything else. All 8, he said, all 8. He was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the mountain, the rock and the pine and the cold, clear air of a June day at altitude, and Clara watched something move through his expression. Not relief exactly, though it was that too. Something older and more fundamental. The specific look of a man who has watched something he built, something he carved out of years of solitary work and kept through sheer stubborn endurance, come back to him intact. Who has watched the thing he was most afraid of losing turn out, in the end, to be the thing that held. "Maggie," he said. "What?" He looked at her. "My wife," he said. Her name was Maggie. The little girl was Rose. He said it plainly, without preamble, and it was clearly something he had been deciding to say for some time. The decision made, probably, some weeks ago, and the moment only now presenting itself correctly. "I haven't said their names out loud in a long time." I stopped because it hurt less. He paused. "But I think not saying them hurt in a different way." Clara held the mare's bridle in both hands and looked at him, at this man who had walked every step of the past 6 months with a broken box under a canvas tarp in his heart, and had carried it steadily and without complaint, and was now standing on his mountain in June, choosing to set it down in the way that you actually things down, not by forgetting, but by saying them out loud to someone who will hear them and hold them carefully. "Maggie and Rose," she said. "Yes." "They would have been glad," Clara said, "about the ruling." He looked at her. "Maggie especially," Clara said. "A woman who chose a man who built a cabin on a mountain, she would have been glad he kept it." Something moved through Wyatt's face that she had no word for and didn't try to name. He reached up and took her hand where it rested on the saddle, and held it for a moment, and she let him. And the mountain was very quiet around them in the way it is on good days, not the heavy silence of isolation, but the openness of a place that is simply steadily itself. "Come back down with me," she said. He did. The summer moved forward the way good summers do, with enough work to keep both hands occupied, and enough ordinary days to appreciate what ordinary means when you've been through the alternative. Clara ran the store. She managed the association. She wrote letters to Price in Denver and received letters back documenting the slow grinding, satisfying progress of a federal case that was doing exactly what a federal case is supposed to do, holding a man to account for what he'd built his power on, and watching that power dissolve under the weight of its own documentation. Silas Granger left Black Hollow in August. He did not announce it. He did not have a farewell or a public statement. He simply was there 1 week and gone the next, and the town understood from the federal proceedings that he had relocated to Denver to be closer to his lawyers, and from subsequent filings that those lawyers were having difficulty, and from a letter Price sent to Clara in October that the criminal charges would proceed to trial in the spring, and the prosecution's case was, in Price's precise and understated words, quite strong. The mill changed ownership. The lumber yard changed ownership. The 2 saloons that had been running under Granger's shadow for years found new management, and one of them was purchased by Margaret Hale's son, who turned it into a respectable establishment that served food and closed at a reasonable hour and was a better business for it. Black Hollow breathed differently. Clara noticed it the way you notice a sound you'd stopped hearing, the specific quality of a town that has been operating under the low continuous pressure of one man's influence and has now released that pressure, not all at once but gradually, like a fist unclenching. People talked more easily, did business more directly. 2 neighbors who had been in a land dispute for 3 years, a dispute that had been quietly kept unresolved by Granger's interests in both properties, settled it in an afternoon over coffee in Clara's store, with her acting as informal mediator. And both of them left satisfied, which was so unusual for a land dispute that it became one of the stories people told afterward. Wyatt started keeping a few of his things at the store. It happened gradually, the way most real things happen, not announced, not formalized, just the accumulation of small practical decisions. His good coat hung on the hook by the door because he'd left it one evening when the weather turned warm and hadn't taken it back on subsequent visits. A pair of tools appeared on the shelf in the storage room. A particular coffee tin he preferred. Clara did not comment on any of it. One evening in September she was closing the store and found him at the back table working on the association quarterly report. She had taught him the format, and he had taken to it with the same quiet precision he gave everything, and she stood in the doorway watching him work for a moment before he looked up. "You're staying tonight," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her, if that's all right. There's a room above the store, she said. It's been empty since I came back. He held her gaze. Clara. It's a room, she said, with a cot and a window that works properly now, because someone replaced the glass. She met his eyes steadily. I'm not making a larger statement than that. It's late and it's a long ride back up the ridge, and you've got the quarterly report half finished. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked back at the report. I'll finish this first, he said. She went upstairs. She lay in her bed in the room above the store that had been her father's and listened to the quiet sounds of him working below the scratch of the pencil, the occasional movement of the chair, the sound of the coffee tin being set down, and the sounds were so particular and so familiar and so entirely, specifically his, that she understood something she had been moving toward for months and had not, until that moment, looked at directly. She was home. Not because of the store, not because of Black Hollow or the window or the legal ruling or any of the external things that had been resolved and restored. She was home because of the sounds coming from the room below. The sounds of a man doing careful work in the space she occupied, and the fact that those sounds felt like the most natural thing in the world. In the morning, he made coffee. She came downstairs and he had the coffee made and the quarterly report finished and clean on the table, and he was standing at the window, the new clear window looking out at the street where Black Hollow was beginning its day. He turned when he heard her. It's done, he said, meaning the report. Good, she said, meaning more than that. And he knew it. She poured the coffee, and they sat across from each other at the table, where they had sat across from each other in different ways, in different rooms, for the better part of a year, on a mountain, and in a lawyer's office, and in a courtroom, and in this store, and drank their coffee in the particular silence that is not empty but full. I want to ask you something, Wyatt said. She looked at him. He turned his cup once in his hands. The gesture, she knew, meant he was choosing his words with care. I've been thinking about the ridge, he said. The cabin. The claim. It's good land, good mining. But it's also, he stopped. It's also just a place I went to be alone, and I was alone there for a long time, and I've been thinking lately that the reason I went up there in the first place to get away from what I'd lost isn't the same reason I'd go up there now. Clara waited. I'd go up there now because it's good work and it's good land and the mountain is. He made a small gesture that was the most expressive thing she'd ever seen from him, a gesture that said the mountain is itself, and I understand. It, and there is satisfaction in that understanding. But I wouldn't go up there to be alone, he said. That's the difference. What are you asking me, Wyatt? He looked at her directly. I'm asking if you'd consider the cabin. Not permanently, not instead of this. He looked around the store. But as a place we go, in the summers maybe. When the writing's good and the weather holds and there's time. He paused. I want to show you the north face, where the gold is. Your father never saw it. I'd like someone to see it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the first morning she'd woken up in that cabin, the sound of wind in pines, and the particular quality of mountain silence. She thought about the cot and the window that faced the ridge and the worn spot on the floor where he stood to pour coffee. She thought about a child's boot and a woman's handkerchief in a broken box, and a man who had spent 7 years learning to survive instead of living, and had walked into a store in Black Hollow one February morning and done something that changed the direction of everything. She thought about her father on the wrong side of the mountain, and what it might have looked like from the right side. Yes, she said. He exhaled. There's one more thing, he said. She waited. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and put something on the table between them. It was small and simple, a ring, plain silver, made with the same functional economy that characterized everything he built. Nothing decorative about it, nothing borrowed from convention except the fact of it. I made it, he said, before I came down this morning. I had the silver from. He stopped. It doesn't matter where from. I made it. He looked at her steadily. I'm not going to make a speech. You know what this is. Clara looked at the ring. She looked at Wyatt. She thought about what she knew and what she'd learned and what she'd earned over the course of a year that had started with a funeral and a ledger full of impossible numbers and a man she'd never met walking through. A door she hadn't expected anyone to come through. She thought about how the best things were usually the ones that arrived without announcement, that didn't perform themselves, that simply were solid and plain and built to last. She picked up the ring. She put it on. She looked at him across the table. "The quarterly report needs to go to Price by Friday," she said. Something happened in Wyatt Blackridge's face that she thought she might spend the rest of her life learning the full vocabulary of. "I know," he said. "And the east shelf bracket you fixed in May is loosening again. I'll look at it tomorrow. And I want to go to the ridge before the first snow," she said. "I want to see the north face. We'll go in October," he said. "Weather's good in October." "All right," she said. And that was the whole of it. No ceremony, no performance, no moment staged for anyone watching. Just two people across a table in a general store in Black Hollow, Colorado, on an ordinary September morning, with coffee going cold between them and a ring on her finger and the particular warmth of a thing settled, not ended, but settled. The way a foundation is settled, not finished but fixed, something that will hold whatever gets built on top of it. They went to the ridge in October, as he'd said they would. The north face was everything he had told her it wasn't, which is to say it was not describable. She stood at the edge of the outcropping, where the mountain dropped away into the valley, and the October light came at an angle that made the quartz in the rock face catch and hold it. And she understood for the first time what her father had been looking for all those years. Not just gold, but the specific beauty of a place that doesn't care whether you find it or not. That holds its treasure in the rock and the light, and the cold, clean air, and gives it freely to anyone willing to come far enough up to see it. He was so close, she said. He wasn't far, Wyatt agreed, standing beside her. He just couldn't hear the directions. No. She was quiet for a moment. He would have liked you, she said. Eventually. After he decided you were right about the north face, which would have taken him 2 or 3 years. But eventually. I know the kind, Wyatt said, and there was something in it that was not humor, but was the thing that lives next to humor in a man who has learned to carry loss without drowning in it. She took his hand. He held it, standing at the edge of the mountain in October, looking out at the country that spread below them, the valley and the town, and the thin silver thread of the creek and, if you knew where to look, the roof of a general store, with a good window pane catching the afternoon light. They stayed until the sun dropped behind the western peaks, and the cold came in fast the way it does at altitude. And then they turned and went back to the cabin, where the fire was laid and needed only a match. And they lit it and sat in the warmth of it and talked about Price's letter, and the spring trial, and the association's plans for the next year, and whether the east shelf bracket needed replacing entirely, rather than just tightening again. They talked the way people talk when they have time and warmth, and the specific luxury of someone across from them who is genuinely listening. Later, when the fire had settled into coals and the night outside was very dark and very cold, and the cabin was warm in the particular way of a place that has been heated by human presence for years, Clara sat with the last of her coffee and looked at Wyatt across the coals. "Do you know what I think the mistake was?" she said. "About how people like Silas operate, the fundamental mistake." He looked at her, waiting, the way he always waited when she was working something out, patient and fully present, giving her the whole of his attention without interrupting it. He believed that a person's value was what they could be made to give up, she said. He measured everything in terms of extraction, what could be taken, what could be leveraged, what he could get if he applied enough pressure to the right place. She paused. He never understood that value doesn't work that way. That what a person is worth isn't what they can be forced to surrender. It's what they choose to build, what they choose to protect, what they stand in front of and say, "This is mine." Not because I own it, because I made it. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. He never built anything, he said. No, Clara said. He only ever took, and when the taking was stopped. There was nothing underneath, she said. No foundation. Just the taking itself. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. That's why it fell. Not because we were powerful. Because he was hollow. Wyatt looked at the coals. Your father dug for gold his whole life, he said quietly. He did, and he never found it. No, but you did. Clara looked at him, at the firelight on his face, and the gray coming in at his beard's edges and the large scarred hands that fixed windows and built cabins and held documents in Denver lawyers' offices and had made from a piece of silver the simplest ring she had ever seen. Yes, she said, I did. Outside, the mountain held its silence the way it always had, enormous and indifferent and permanent in all the ways that human lives are not, which is not cruelty but simply the nature of a mountain. Inside the cabin, two people sat with the last warmth of a good fire, having come through a year that had asked everything of them and found, on the other side of it, that what remained was exactly what mattered. There are stories told in Colorado even now about the mountain man who paid a woman's debt in gold dust and asked for nothing. People tell it at counters and in back rooms and on porches in the long summer evenings when the light lasts, and there is time for the kind of story that reminds you why certain things are worth fighting for. What those stories don't always capture, because stories tend toward the dramatic moment and away from the long faithful days that come after, is what Wyatt Blackridge and Clara Whitmore actually built in the years that followed. The Miners' Association that protected 11 claims on the North Ridge and eventually became the model for two similar organizations in neighboring counties. The store that became known, among those who traveled the Ridge country, as the one place where the accounts were always honest, and the woman behind the counter always knew the law. The federal trial that sent Silas Granger to prison for 4 years and returned to 7 families the land and the dignity that had been methodically taken from them. The cabin on the north face that was used every October, without exception, for the rest of their lives. The gold dust that Wyatt Blackridge poured on that counter in February of 1878 had been a season's work. It was significant. It was enough to change the direction of 2 lives, and through those lives, the direction of a town. But it was not the greatest thing he ever gave. The greatest thing was simpler and required no gold at all. It required only a man willing to walk through a door toward someone who needed standing beside, and to stay to keep showing up, to keep fixing the brackets and making the coffee, and filing the documents and riding down from the mountain. Again and again, for all the ordinary days that are not dramatic and do not make for stories but are, in the end, the whole of what a life is built from. Clara Whitmore knew her own worth long before Wyatt Blackridge walked through her door. She had known it standing with a cast-iron skillet between herself and everything, and she had known it in a cabin on a mountain with a fever and a fire she refused to let go out. And she had known it sitting across from Delia Foster in a front room on the east side of town. And she had known it in a courtroom, watching a judge's ruling land on the right side of the law. But she had also learned, in the year that began with a funeral and a ledger and a stranger in a doorway, that knowing your own worth and having someone who recognizes it are not the same thing, and that the second is rarer and more precious than any amount of gold in any mountain in Colorado. She had both. She had built both, with her own hands and her father's ledger, and a man who turned out against all appearance to be exactly what he was. Some fortunes are buried. Some fortunes are waiting in the rock of a mountain for someone to dig far enough and look in the right direction and do the long, cold, patient work of bringing them up into the light. And some fortunes, the best ones, the ones that last, are not found at all. They are made, day by day, by 2 people who choose each other on purpose, without hesitation, without conditions, in full knowledge of everything the other has been through, and everything they are. That is the only kind of wealth that no man can ever take from you. That is what they found, and what they kept, and what they never, not once, let go.